In all these conversations, I have avoided, in a number of cases, announcing these or those conclusions from what I am saying. I just stopped at the line beyond which it is necessary to draw a conclusion and moved on to some other question. Why? Because we do not like when people think on the basis of ready-to-use, alien opinions of those people who they have elevated to the level of authority. A normal human society is a society of people who feel life, independently think, and come to these or those conclusions about how to live further, how to eliminate problems inherited from the past, and what is the essence of these problems. I have referred to the Bible, the Quran, other scriptures, without giving exact quotations, for anyone interested in exact quotes. The materials of the conception of social safety contain all these quotes with an exact indication of where and what something comes from. The same applies to the circumstance that I referred to some facts without giving the sources from which information about these facts became available. Also, everything is in the materials of the conception of social safety. In the books, all the facts are mentioned, with an indication of the sources from where they were taken. So, the reality is such that we live in such a time that the personal culture of psychic activity of the overwhelming majority of people suffers from such a defect as the substitution of memory of real events with games of the imagination on the theme of the past. Therefore, no conversations, lectures can be the basis for a person to say that now I know about this problem either everything that I need or the necessary minimum that allows me to work with this problem. In modern conditions, any lectures, conversations, sermons, they can only indicate the real or imaginary fact of the existence of some problems. But, in order to have an adequate understanding of these problems, every person must feel life, see these problems in life, if they are real, or admit their illusionness if someone fell victim to their own hypersensitivity of baseless fantasies. Therefore, the fact that this cycle of lectures and conversations was recorded is only a reason for a certain number of those people who will watch it to turn to life as such and to ponder over the meaning of human life and their own meaning of life. Last time, I spoke about the global historical process and said that the conception of globalization in this global historical process is present. This conception is expressed in the Bible as the doctrine of buying up the world on the basis of a monopoly on usury, and that this is not the result of the action of a social element, but is the product of the activity of the hierarchy of the ancient Egyptian jretshood, who at one time degraded and wanted undivided power over the world in the name of God. And the fact that all this goes back to prehistory, and the prehistory is stable fascism on a racial basis, which, judging by the ancient Greek and other myths, became the norm of life of the previous global civilization which perished in a geophysical global catastrophe about 13,000 years ago, thereby freeing humanity from that fascism and providing an opportunity to build a global civilization on different principles. Nevertheless, the dominant of the global historical process is activity oriented on the revival, the restoration of that which was in the past global civilization, and the reproduction of those vices that led to its death. And correspondingly, there arises the question about an alternative. How to live further, and how to relate to globalization. In the last 20 years, such a subculture as anti-globalists has emerged. What are anti-globalists unhappy with? The anti-globalists are unhappy with globalization in general. That is, when faced with the negative consequences of globalization on the basis of the biblical doctrine, they think that this is the only possible variant of globalization, or do not think at all, and try to hold on to their national cultures, turning them into fortresses that are supposed to protect every one of them from the penetration of other national cultures, other confessional cultures. The reality is such that globalization is an objective process. It is inevitable by virtue of the biological unity of humanity. And, in addition, processes which are controlled by people who do not think about globalization at all play an important role in globalization. Let's look. In Russia, everyone knows the song, "A Million Scarlet Roses." If we turn to how it relates to globalization, then it is based on a case from the life of the Georgian artist Pirosmani and a French actress. Then Raymond Pauls appears, who processes the melody of the national Latvian song. Alla Pugacheva sings it in Russian, in the verse of a Russian-speaking poet. Which of them thought about globalization? None of them did. But, nonetheless, outside the process of globalization, this song could not appear in principle. And there are many such events in history when globalization is actually conducted by those people who do not even think about it. And after, in the 20th century, the mass media and communications became accessible to the broad masses, tourism became the norm of life. The migration of the population to permanent residence in other regions of the planet also acquired a rather significant character in statistics. Then globalization simply manifested itself as a process, although it is the essence of history. Throughout the memorable history of humanity, and the prehistory of humanity too. Prehistory. This is that which was, but that which we don't remember. Therefore, it turns out that if globalization is objective, inevitable, and that concrete globalization, which is carried out on the basis of the biblical doctrine of buying up the world, does not suit very many, then the alternative to this globalization can only be globalization on the basis of a different conception. Different in what sense? Different in its nravious orientations, ideals. different in the principles of building a social organization, different in the principles of building the economy, and the interaction of civilization with the natural environment. If we look at globalization from such positions, then the deployment of the alternative conception should begin with the conscious comprehension of not very complex for understanding ideas. First, humanity is part of the biosphere. This means that there are objective laws that regulate the interaction of all species in the biosphere with each other, and the interaction of the biosphere with the encompassing it geological processes of the planet and the processes of the cosmos. What do we know from textbooks about these objective laws? Nothing. How is politics built in accordance with them? Politics is built athwart of them. The simplest example, the changing of the clocks to 2 hours ahead of astronomical time. The rhythmics of the daily rotation of the Earth, the rhythmics of the annual rotation of the Earth around the Sun, sets the biorhythms for the entire atmosphere. In addition to this, the Moon rotates around the Earth, and with its gravitational field and other fields, it affects what happens on the Earth. And according to the logic of things, humanity should live in this rhythmics. But some figures do not have enough sensitivity or intellect in order not to move the clock 2 hours forward. Other figures do not have enough sensitivity or intellect to return the clock to astronomical time. And we still live an hour ahead of astronomical time. This is one of the indicators. Another indicator. This is the concentration of the population into cities with a population of over 1 million, where mutagenic factors are so powerful that the reproduction of a biologically healthy population is, in principle, impossible. In addition, humanity is a specific biological species, different from all other biological species in the biosphere. This means that there are biological objective laws that characterize man as a biological species, and the life of civilization should also be built in accordance with these objective laws. What here is most significant? Most significant are the concretics of the layout of the programs of instinctive behavior and the peculiarities of the psychology of each of the sexes. Culture should also be built in accordance with them. It should take them into account, but not act against them. What is really going on? The reality is such that the psychology of boys and girls is different. The method of understanding and perceiving information in adolescence is different. And accordingly, if we want both boys and girls to receive a good education, studying in the majority of subjects should be separate, simply by strength of the fact that the methods of world perception are different, and accordingly, the presentation of information should also be different. Further, hypodynamia kills and cripples. Our school is a school that cripples everyone with hypodynamia. Statistics show that children do not grow during the school year. Why? Because there is hypodynamia. Children grow on vacation. But there is one exception. Vladimir Filipovich Pazarny, created a pedagogical system that excludes hypodynamia from the educational process and is oriented towards the separate education of boys and girls in the majority of subjects. There is an exception. After all, humanity is a two-sexed species, but not two species that should be at enmity with one another. Therefore, humanitarian subjects should be mastered in the communication of boys and girls in the process of study. The program, the system, received certification. It is the only system currently certified as safe and healthy for children. Nevertheless, it has not become the norm, and the Ministry of Education and Science continues to kill and cripple children with hypodynamia. In addition to this, an in essence idiotic testing system, which is oriented towards building the educational process in such a way as to suppress creativity and grow a moron who can only somehow select a menu item in a computer program. Humanity. This is one of the biological species that carries culture. Culture. This is all the information and algorithmics that are passed from generation to generation in addition to the genetic mechanism of the biological species. Culture is variative. What does this mean? This means that society is able to build a culture that will kill it over the course of 2 or 3 generations. And society is able to build a culture relying on which it will live in harmony with nature, practically in an automatic mode. And this will free up the creative potential of society for the solution of some other tasks and for the creation of a certain new quality of life. Accordingly, there are socio-cultural objective laws that also need to be known in order not to kill society by the method of cultural cooperation with any of its geopolitical competitors. What is here? Here, there is the dominance of liberalism, when the norm is limitless diversity. This non-determinedness of the norm does not allow distinguishing between degradation and development. As an effect, the widest gates are opened for degradational processes, and, as a result of mass degradation of the population, society and the state are experiencing a tremendous amount of problems. Further, the reality is such that we cannot live in the natural environment without being protected from it by the technosphere. At the very least, we can't live under that culture which we have created, and which, in many respects, blocks our genetically inherent potential of development. The technosphere is created in the course of economic activity, and, accordingly, there exist certain objective laws connected with this economic activity. Following these objective laws, in principle, makes it possible to ensure the economic life of each person, each family, all those who are ready to honestly, dobrosovietchesly participate in the social association of labor. And the violation of these objective laws leads to the fact that society can simply die of hunger. What can we say about our education in economics and finance?
Ничего хорошего.
There will be quotes of the highest level. Alexander Yakovlevich Lifshitz, now deceased. Remember the program Ask Lifshitz? In the past, he was an assistant to President Yeltsin on questions of economics. Next, Deputy Prime Minister of the Russian government, Minister of Finance, then a member of the Board of Directors of a number of holdings. In one of his interviews, he said the phrase, The economy, however, is like a woman. How can you really understand it? You see, if from a unified standpoint we approach the economy as a science and as strength of materials, if as a science, then the scientific consistency of strength of materials is expressed in the fact that the mechanisms work, houses and bridges are erected. If something breaks, then it is not Hooke's law, on the basis of which the strength of materials is built, which is to blame, but it is some fool who could not master the strength of materials at university and could not correctly calculate a certain structure who is to blame. For example, the Volgograd city bridge, which began to dance under the impact of the wind. The blame lies either with the builders and operators who violated the technology, as a result of which the object turned out to be less durable than it should have been, or with the operators, who shoved the object into an off-design mode of operation, where it broke down. That is, we cannot have any claims in relation to the strength of materials as a science, because its scientific consistency is confirmed in everyday life. And if we assume such a situation that a student comes to take an examination on the strength of materials and begins, "Professor, continuum mechanics is like a woman. How can you really understand it?" The professor freezes and says, "Young man, what you said is epoch-making. You deserve not only an excellent mark, but also a candidate's degree. No, even a Doctor of Sciences." But the aphorism made by Lifshitz is at the level of this student low marker who came to take an exam and declares that, "Professor, continuum mechanics is like a woman. How can you really understand it?" The difference consists only in the fact that there was no one to hold Lifshitz responsible for this aphorism. Then Arkady Vladimirovich Dvorkovich appeared, the carrier of 3 economic educations from different higher educational institutions. Speaking at the Plekhanov Academy of National Economics in front of students in 2009, he dropped the following phrase: "Economists were invented so that forecasters would look good against their background." This phrase is such that on one hand, it also speaks of the development of economics and its consistency as a science, and on the other hand, it characterizes the outlook of Arkady Vladimirovich, who also in the past was an advisor to the president on questions of economics, and is now the deputy prime minister of the Russian government. The fact is that in the history of our country, there have been 2 very intelligent and widely erudite people who contributed to the development of a number of scientific disciplines. These are Admiral Stepan Osipovich Makarov and Lieutenant General of the Corps of Naval Engineers, Academician Alexei Nikolaevich Krylov. The following aphorism is attributed to them, possibly because they were friends and they had a certain commonality of ideas. The aphorism goes like this: "To the exact sciences I attribute mathematics, astronomy, navigation, and to the inexact sciences, astrology, palmistry, meteorology." Without knowing it, Arkady Vladimirovich became a victim of this aphorism, because economics ended up on this list after meteorology, which is preceded by palmistry. But if we talk about scientific consistency, This is an indicator that, at the very least, since the beginning of the reforms in the 1990s, the internal Russian power over our economy, over our national economy, has been in the hands of knowingly incompetent people. Because if they were competent, we would not know of such aphorisms. And if economics had been developed to the level of strength of materials at least, there are also unresolved problems there. And were the politics really directed towards the blago of the population, but not towards the good of the oligarchy, first of all the transnational global oligarchy, then there would be no economic problems in Russia, because practice is the criterion of truth. If science is science, then its result should be expressed in blagorious fruits, which are brought into activity on the basis of its scientific theories and models, developed on the basis of theories. If activity seems to be scientifically substantiated, and the results are rubbish, then the revision should not begin with how much O.Y. Vassilieva has stolen, whether she cheats or not. The revision should begin from the Academy of Sciences, from the departments of social sciences, posing the question, who is empty-headed and a demagogue, and who really has some scientific knowledge to his name? And then there arises a question, why is this knowledge not implemented in educational standards? That is, the revision goes to the Ministry of Education and Science, and, ultimately, it leads to the question, who is the fool and who is the enemy of the people? And then, if you look at the totality of these categories of objective laws, pan-biospheric, socio-cultural, economic objective laws, then what else remains? There remains ethics that goes beyond the boundaries of society, and it's expressed in noospheric-religious objective laws. We live in a society where religion exists by itself, science by itself, activity of people by itself, and ethics is allegedly localized only within society. But the reality is such that if you look at history, it turns out that those political forces that are inclined to violate ethical objective laws, or try to impose deeply vicious Nravia standards and corresponding ethics on people, are, for some reason, systematically unlucky in critical situations. That is, the noosphere and the Almighty, they also exert an impact on reality, on the life of society. One of the latest examples, vipers bit Ukrainian special forces. This is a noospheric phenomenon. Vipers are also part of the noosphere. Ukrainian special forces, working for Nazism, came into conflict with the noosphere, and not only with the population of the Donbass and Luhansk regions. Therefore, the vipers bit them. Someone may think that everything that has been said is stupidity. Those guys were just unlucky. But the opponents, after all, were lucky. Their special forces were not bitten by vipers.
Да, но с другой стороны, этот спецназ потом идет и убивает какое-то количество людей. И за это он отделывается только некоторыми укусами. То есть, в общем, если мы рассматриваем ситуацию вреда, он наносит больше, чем он получил возмездие.
In the Quran, there are the following words. If God were to take mankind to task for their wrongdoing, he would not leave hereon a living creature.
Ну, это как взыскивать?
This is one side of the question. The second side of the question, if we again talk about Ukraine, then, in Soviet times, they quietly dreamed of aggressing from the power of the Politburo, all this insanity of the elders, and of living independently. since the natural conditions and the Ukrainian economy make it possible to live better than they did in the Soviet Union, if the quality of governance were raised. They voted for the Declaration of Independence and began to build an independent statehood. 23 years. This is an entirely sufficient time frame in which to build a statehood capable of solving problems. And, if not for the stable reproduction of itself in the future, then at least for modification, in accordance with the new challenges of the time. Let's count. 1917, the collapse of the statehood of the Russian Empire. 1940, the Soviet government is fully capable of repelling Hitler's aggression. The periods are comparable, but in the case of Ukraine, what? The idea that he who does not jump is a Moscow is not constructive in relation to the building of a statehood. But, while all banderism after 1991 was striving for power, quite a big number of the population of Ukraine believed that this did not concern them. That there are Banderovites, ultranationalists, some psychos who dream up their own history. So what to pay attention to, if they don't constitute the majority of society and are especially weightless in politics? They were weightless, now they carry weight. Next comes questions of so-called innocent children. You see, humanity is one in the series of generations, and dobro and love, it all manifests itself not only in relation to those living now, it also manifests itself in care that the future of our children and grandchildren is better than ours and our ancestors. Therefore, fathers, mothers, grandfathers, grandmothers of those children who suffer in this Ukrainian nightmare, they are directly responsible for what is happening now in Ukraine. Because the excuses on the theme that I am a little person, nothing depends on me, these excuses come to the question, what have you personally done in order not to be a little person, and in order that something would depend on you, in making the life of your country and the life of humanity better? The majority thinks that posing such a question is inappropriate. It is appropriate, because the ability to answer this question of every citizen expresses that which liberals call civil society. Although, if citizens are able to answer this question, this is no longer liberalism, it is a completely different society. It turns out that the 5 categories of objective laws, pan-biospheric, species-specific of man, socio-cultural, noospheric-religious, and economic objective laws, they each cover its own sphere of activity. But the consequences of the fact that the objective laws of each of the groups are realized, they have consequences in other spheres of activity. And, accordingly, conflicts between different categories of objective laws are possible. What conflicts? For example, the development of medicine, in the form in which it is, undermines the genetic health of the biological species. But, nonetheless, medicine works for the instinct of self-preservation of everyone, an individual instinct. And thus, there arises a conflict between species-specific objective laws and their cultural shells, and pan-biospheric objective laws. In other words, there should be a certain line in society when medicine says, "No, guys, we don't interfere with this problematics. This person should die quietly, calmly. We can only alleviate his suffering." Or another variant. This person should not pass on defective genes to his descendants, and accordingly, there should not be any artificial insemination, and so on and so forth. But, nevertheless, society thinks like this: I can do whatever I want. And if any problems arise, the descendants will shovel through these problems in some way. So it turns out that the entire set of processes connected with each category of objective laws must be governed. And this leads to the fact that there are objective laws of governance in general, and they are one, whether a child rides a tricycle, or several states organize some kind of joint action to implement a complex project, as a result of which they should all get one or another political effect. What is the most relevant for us now, for the post-Soviet space?
Собирание вместе тех осколков.
Putting together is only one part, and the reality is such that it's anyway a good thing to revive the Aral Sea. But, in the conditions of the liberal market economic model to which all these states adjoining it are committed, this is impossible. This means that the catastrophe there will only develop, causing further social and economic damage to the population of all the neighboring states, and, perhaps, even putting some of them on the brink, if not of existence, within the current borders. Then some of the territories will simply be a desert, unsuitable for life. In the best case, it will be possible to conduct economic activities there on a rotational basis. You come to work, you leave, next shift. There is a lot that one should know. Unfortunately, the reality is such that if the politicians in the State Duma, in the government, are asked questions about these 6 categories of objective laws, on the basis of which state politics should be built for the blago of the entire population, then most of them will not even understand what this is about. That is, our situation is really close to the situation that Prosper Merimee described in the novel Tamango, the ship that needs to be governed, but there is no knowledge to govern this ship, and there are no skills. And to steer, that is, to press the buttons and pull the levers on the control panel and see what will happen, and to govern, that is, foresee, have certain objectives, and press the buttons on the same control panel and pull the levers, foreseeing the consequences that lead to the chosen objectives. These are 2 different things. In fact, we all need to learn how to govern. Moreover, this idea has been purpose-orientedly discredited over the past century. How is it discredited? Everyone knows the aphorism in the following edition: every cook must govern the state. Let us begin with the fact that Lenin did not say such nonsense. In the article, "Will the Bolsheviks retain state power?" he wrote the exact opposite, along the lines of the following: "We are not utopians, and we understand that every laborer, cook, is not able to govern the state now. But we are against the prejudice that only representatives of the wealthy classes can govern the state. And in the first decades of Soviet power, many, referring to Lenin, recalled that he said, "Every cook must learn to govern the state." And if you search the internet, you can find posters of that time that bear this slogan. Now let's see what will happen if governorial literacy for everyone is the same norm as literacy in the sense of reading and writing. If this is a universal norm, then in every sphere of professional activity, everyone is governorially literate, and, accordingly, if the head of a unit, at any level of the vertical of power, begins to abuse power, or simply makes too many mistakes, then there is reason to tell him, "Dear fellow, thank you for what you have done. Go and work as an ordinary subordinate in accordance with your knowledge, and other people will govern." The correlation between professional knowledge and governorial knowledge is such that the theory of governance can be mastered in about 6 months to such an extent that the current processes are interpreted as processes of governance or self-governance. And, on this basis, further enter into governance towards them and bring them to the desired by you result. And the mastery of knowledge that characterizes a particular subject domain. This is not 6 months. The basic level of professionalism given by higher educational institutions, this is 5 years. And reaching the highest level of professionalism is the beginning of labor activity in the relevant field on the basis of basic education and continuous self-study and study of this field of activity, as a result of which a person becomes a professional in 5 to 10 years. But purely professional knowledge, knowledge of the subject domain, is anyway not enough to govern. If society is governorially illiterate in its mass, then it experiences a deficiency of governorial cadres, who are professionally consistent precisely as governors. And this deficiency is expressed in 2 ways. On the one hand, those governors who have the opportunity to earn monopolistically high salaries for what they do. And look, the salaries of top managers, high-ranking politicians, they are manifoldly higher than the average salaries in most sectors. The justification begins like this. They shoulder a special responsibility, they work very hard, and they have to be paid for it. But the reality is such that in any sphere of activity, the functional operability of any person is limited by his natural biorhythmics. Therefore, there exists biorhythmics, and for more than 8 hours a day, a person, for the most part, is not able to work productively. And, accordingly, if a person spends more than 8 hours a day at work, occupied with even responsible endeavors, then, in excess of these 8 hours, he cannot work effectively. And he spends time at work constantly busy, or because he could not organize the work of his subordinates in such a way as to cope with all matters within 8 hours. Or, indeed, there is such an acute governorial deficiency in society that there is no one to replace him. Further, there arises another interesting circumstance. If we look at different states in terms of the quality of life, the quality of the technosphere, the quality of economic development, and the ratio of top managers' income to the average, it turns out that the higher this ratio, the more problems in the economy and with the quality of life in the state, especially if we consider this over historically long intervals of time. According to the data of the late 1970s, the lowest ratio was in Japan. In the Federal Republic of Germany, it was a little more. In the USA, it was even more. And if we evaluate the ratio, taking into account the state support of senior officials in the USSR, then the USSR was the leader in terms of this ratio. And the quality of governance was the opposite. Where the gap was the highest, the quality of governance was the lowest. And where the gap was the lowest, in Japan, the quality of governance was the highest. In particular, this was expressed in the fact that when the Japanese began to supply cars to the American market, there appeared a publication on this theme, saying that the Americans carried out flaw detection of the Japanese car and a new American car using one and the same methodics. And it turned out, the Americans have 17 defects for one car, the Japanese have one defect for two cars. The flaw detection was carried out using one and the same methodics. And in our country, where the ratio was the greatest, everything ended in the catastrophe of statehood and culture in 1991. If you look at Obama's book, The Audacity of Hope, Thoughts on Reclaiming the American Dream, judging by the events that followed, the book is smarter than Obama. But, nonetheless, the book notes the fact that the worst mistakes in American economics and politics were made by people who received the highest salaries. What is the problem? The problem is that when salaries in the sphere of governance go off scale in relation to the average, then the sphere of governance becomes attractive for crooks and intriguers, for whom high salaries are the meaning and objective in life, but they are not able to govern. But since they are superior to others in intrigue and crookery, not only do they oust high professional governors from the sphere of governance, they simply do not let them in there. Therefore, if society believes that very high salaries have to be paid for high positions, then this leads to a catastrophe. And for Russia, this gap is one of the pressing internal political problems that hinder the country's development. And the second fact, connected with the governorial illiteracy of the majority, consists in the fact that there is simply no one to replace these bad governors, who are either simply incompetent or obviously vicious and abuse their official status. In fact, it turns out that in the conditions of society, where labor is divided into professional governorial labor and subordinate labor, mostly productive labor, there are two variants for enclosing feedback lines on governors. Either the policy of gradually reducing their wages and other incomes to the average level in other sectors, or repression, that is, a grave governorial error must be accompanied by ruthless and merciless repressions against the one who committed it, without any mitigating their blame circumstances. Another question is how repressions can be formed. In Stalin's times, it was the gulag, or the execution, of those who did harm. In milder times, this can be in the form of employment in road construction with a crowbar and a shovel for 10 years, without the right to continue to be engaged in governorial activities. I think that many of those who are mentioned in connection with various corruption scandals and other abuses of office, if they knew that such a prospect is inevitable, they would have behaved differently. And if they had continued to behave in the same way, then society would not have a problem in replacing them with other people who are more consistent as governors and can work for the interests of society, not for a high fee, but for an idea. Because the idea, this is really the most reliable instrument for eradicating corruption. Because there is such a question: what idea can you give your life for? The answer is this: for that idea, without the realization of which life has no meaning. And if society carries the idea of global significance, without which there is no meaning in life, then corruption in this society is impossible. Errors are possible. Corruption as a universal venality is impossible. And, accordingly, the means of governance of the fourth priority, that is, the principle where the army will not pass, a donkey laden with gold will pass, are blocked by opponents. Well, there is one anecdote about the fight against corruption. To assign names to two destroyers of the Russian Navy, incorruptible in the aspect of defense, and corrupting in the aspect of influencing the enemy. And then it turns out that modern civilization is characterized by the fact that there is statehood. Statehood can be determined as a subculture of governance towards affairs of social as a whole significance in the localities and at the scale of society on a professional basis. Abraham Lincoln basically spoke about this. The legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do at all, or cannot do so well for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. And he supplemented this definition of the tasks of statehood with a proviso. You cannot help people permanently by doing for them what they could and should do for themselves. That is, it presupposes that a normal state is the initiative of citizens and the professional activity of governors in the state apparatus, which mutually supplement and support each other. At the same time, Abraham Lincoln gave the following definition of democracy: as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. In fact, it was for this that he was killed. We live in conditions where, for a long time, we have been convinced that the state should withdraw from the economy and from many other spheres where everything should supposedly work on the principles of self-organization, and so on and so forth. But if we talk about what is necessary for society to live well, then we must turn to this picture. The picture shows the cyclics of solving particular tasks of governance. This cyclics is such that in order for society to live well, in this cyclics, the objective laws of all 6 categories, about which I spoke, must be realized. The second feature of this cyclics is that apart from the state as the highest intrasocial, constantly acting governor, there is no one else to coordinate the solution of tasks in this cyclics. And, accordingly, the state apparatus must be competent in every one of the particular tasks connected with this cyclics. What is shown here? The top right segment of the picture shows the land use structure. The structure of land use in every region is not only a table or a bar chart of the use of the land fund for certain tasks. The structure of land use is the concretics of landscapes of different types, in a concrete way, distributed over the terrain of every region. The figure shows the structure of optimal land use, detected by the Greek architect Doxiadis back in the 1970s. 40% is reserved land, the size of which must be sufficient to reproduce all biological species that are characteristic of the corresponding natural climatic zone. By strength of the fact that the objective law of the reproduction of the biological species is such that the birth rate is excessive in relation to the capacity of the ecological niche, then, from these reserved areas, biological species will migrate to other zones where man conducts this or that economic activity, or which he can visit for recreation, and where any human activity, economic activity, even rest, interferes with the reproduction of these biological species. Thus, it turns out that according to Doxiadis, 82% of the territory should be natural landscapes, either completely reserved or recreational zones where man can rest, restore health in communication with nature. Further, about 10% is agricultural land. About 4% is the territory of agriculture, and about 0.2% are industrial landscapes and places for processing the waste of civilization, where natural biocenoses, in principle, cannot exist. According to Doxiadis, this is what must be provided in every region in order for nature to be safe and the population to live in environmentally friendly conditions. Accordingly, this presupposes the working out of a biospheric ecological policy of the state. After Stalin undertook a program of watering the steppes, developing forest belts, planting forests, which received the name Stalin's Ecological Revolution, no one has been involved in this, especially after 1991. We just predatorily, parasitically destroy landscapes, undermining the possibilities of the good existence of future generations. But this must be engaged in. Further, the reality is that the technosphere and the way of life tied to the technosphere, industry cannot exist without infrastructures. Accordingly, there should be an infrastructural policy that coordinates the passage of infrastructures with natural landscapes on the basis of the requirements of both ensuring biospheric safety and on the basis of the requirement to ensure the life of society and its economic activity. And accordingly, the structure of land use in every region determines the capacity of the ecological niche that society can occupy in this region with the taken shape culture and farming skills. What do we have in this case? In this case, the conclusion is inevitable that all regions are not equivalent in the aspect of reproduction of a biologically healthy population. Megalopolises are an unfavorable environment. 100 kilometers around the megalopolises, the landscapes are crippled. Then there are the regions where we are engaged in the extraction of minerals and the processing of these minerals. The chemical industry and metallurgy are also such that the reproduction of a biologically healthy population in these regions is problematic. And accordingly it turns out that the state is obliged to work out a demographic policy which should determine the requirements for the medical biological indicators of the health of new generations and should ensure the reproduction of the health of the population in regions with an unfavorable environmental situation on account of migration to these regions, of excessive population from regions with normal, favorable ecological situations. And in order for such migration not to cause intrasocial conflicts, it is necessary to take care that the society is obviously ethically homogeneous, and that the migrant is not reacted to as an enemy, including because the behavior of the migrant in relation to the indigenous population of the region is parasitically aggressive, as is the case now. Because the majority of our so-called labor migration is people whose life in the regions where they were born have not taken shape in a favorable way, and under the impact of either economic or political turmoil, they moved to Russia to work. In fact, the majority of migrants are lumpen. These are people, psychologically, morally broken, who, on the territory of Russia or outside the regions where their national cultures were formed in Russia, simply survive. And without a demographic policy, including the one that takes into account the ethno-confessional characteristics of different groups of the population in different regions, Russia, as an integral state, cannot exist. And the Institute of Ethnography, unfortunately, is not very competent in questions of national and mutually interconfessional relations. Because, in reality, after Stalin wrote Marxism and the National Question, no one has engaged in this problematics in essence. If someone has engaged in this, they have done so not in order to reveal the truth, but in order to scientificize a policy that the state has already in one way or another pursued at this or that stage of its development. Then it turns out that if a biospheric and environmental policy is worked out, an infrastructural policy is worked out, a demographic policy is worked out, then all this needs economic support. What does economic support mean? This means that you must have a prognosis of the needs of all these types of policies, plus the external political needs of the state. And, accordingly, you must prepare the productive forces of the country for full and guaranteed economic satisfaction of all these needs. And what does it mean to prepare the country's productive forces for what will be in the future? This means that it's necessary to create new production facilities. It is necessary to reconstruct the existing production facilities, and it is necessary to prepare a cadre base for these productions. And the reality is that the liberal market economic model does not allow economically to support either the cyclics as a whole or any of its stages. Why? Because in society there are activities that in principle are not realizable on a commercial basis. There are types of activities that are not realizable in the required volumes on the principles of internal financing. And, in addition, by force of the nravious ethical depravity of society, there are commercially effective types of activities that bring great harm to society and the biosphere of the planet. And something has to be done with all this. Something has to be suppressed, and something has to be preserved. And there is nobody but the state to do this. But the state can do this only if it has a system, long-term, strategic, multivariative prognosis and planning of the country's biospheric social economic development. The reality is such that the scientific methodological apparatus for these tasks is not sought after by Russian politicians, especially the liberal ones, and science, by virtue of the peculiarities of education, when narrow specialists with an extremely narrow outlook are trained, although they know something related to this problematics, but on the whole, they are also not ready to provide scientific methodological support for solving these tasks. In addition, there is one more feature. I will talk about this later when we talk about the economy. It is concluded in the fact that the overwhelming majority of the population and politicians do not understand what the financial credit system is and what the price is. The financial credit system is an instrument of structureless governance towards the macroeconomy. one of the many instruments of structuralist governance. This means that any amount of money does not play any role by itself if there is no system in line with which this amount of money can be realized in some way. For example, who needs deposits, say, of a suitcase with Reichsmarks of the Third Reich? Yes, you can sell a certain amount of this paper to numismatists, but at the same time, the pieces of paper with an eagle and a swastika are not a means of payment. It does not allow solving economic tasks. But the fact that any currency has significance only within the financial credit system, which functions and functions stably, does not reach many heads until a financial catastrophe occurs, when everyone urgently begins to get rid of their currency and buy banknotes of other countries. But the reality is such that indeed the financial credit system has value as a whole, precisely as an element of governance. And then the question arises, to whom does it belong? In reality, it should belong to the state. But juridically, in our country, it belongs to the central bank. And the central bank is the representative office of the Federal Reserve on the territory of Russia, since it is in no way subordinate to our state. And even if we turn to the Constitution, then the central bank does not have any responsibilities for which it can be held accountable, because the term ensure the ruble's strength, how the ruble's strength is measured, this is an open, debatable question. That is, there is no concretics. The central bank has no duties and responsibilities to the country, neither to the state nor to the population.
Так он даже твердость эту не обеспечивает, иначе курс бы не прыгал рубля и не рос бы.
The question about the exchange rate is a question of a different kind, because the question about the exchange rate, this is a question of governance towards export-import balance. Therefore, in some cases, the exchange rate may be lower in order to simplify our own exports, and in some cases it may be higher in order to ensure imports. Therefore, the question is not about the ruble's strength. The question consists in the fact that the central bank has no concrete obligations. Imagine a situation where the helmsman on a ship does not obey the captain, but via mobile phone he is controlled by someone from another ship. Here, we have approximately the same interrelationship between the Ministry of Economic Development, the Ministry of Finance, and the Central Bank. In principle, if you govern the economy in line with this cyclics, then the Central Bank, the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Economic Development should be subdivisions of the same department, and one person should be personally responsible for their activities. In order for him to be personally responsible for their activities, he must know the biology of biocenosis, problematics of ecology, human biology, human psychology in its different variations, the theory of governance, economics, finance. And who knows this in our country? And even if such a person appears, he is anyway solely and personally unable to replace the entire state apparatus, which, over the past 20 years, has been nurtured on the delusions of liberalism, the place of the adherents of whom is either in the psychiatric hospital for those who are sincere, or in prison, since adherence to bourgeois liberalism and the economic liberal model, these are indicators of fraud or high treason. There is no other way. But, nonetheless, there exists this side of the question. If we understand the role of the financial credit system, then the role of price in the life of society turns out to be twofold. At the level of enterprise, that is, at the microeconomic level, this is the cost price of production plus the claim for profit. If there are competitors, then the higher you are able to raise the price of your products and ensure their sales, then this is an indirect indicator that your products, from the point of view of a potential consumer, are of a higher quality than the products of competitors. This if we take out of consideration advertising as a system of brainwashing and shaping social opinion on consumer questions, and the activities of marketers, who in some cases can create demand out of thin air, in order to ensure the commercial effectiveness of an enterprise regardless of the needs of society. And at the macroeconomic level, the price is not at all an indicator of product quality. The price at the macroeconomic level is an indicator of the deficiency of these or those types of products and natural goods. And it is in no way related to the cost price of production, because the reality is such that if you can get to the beach somewhere in nature, then your expenses are only the cost of the trip there. And if, for example, in Moscow, which has more than 10 million inhabitants, 10 or 20 places suitable for swimming in reservoirs, then, sooner or later, access to the beach becomes paid, although no one invested any economic resources in the creation of these natural goods. And it already happened in Japan. When Tokyo was choking with smog, in Tokyo, there were booths where you could go, pay some money, and breathe some clean air for a while. Remember the novel by Belyaev named Air Seller? The price rises when there is a shortage of products. And what does this mean from the point of view of theory of governance? This means a simple thing, that if the economy is developing successfully, and it works to satisfy the real needs of the population, then, to the measure of the economic power becoming sufficient for the satisfaction of these needs, the price should fall, since the deficiency of production disappears, and there is no need to restrain financial solvency of use. But then the question arises of how to overcome this paradox, that at the micro level of production, it should be profitable, but at the macro level, if there is enough production, the end consumer should eventually get it free of charge. The answer to this question is that yes, the price and the market mechanism are the regulator of supply and demand. But prices for certain types of goods should be state-fixed. I will tell you about the reasons and how to do it later. But the tax and grant mechanism is an instrument for governing the profitability thresholds of production in sectors and regions, which allows maintaining production volumes at the level necessary for the development of society in conditions when the price falls below the profitability threshold. Look at the attitude towards grants and subsidies in our country. What is it like in the majority of cases? No point in feeding the parasites, they say. But if we take the tax grant mechanism as an instrument of governance, then the slogan, "No point in feeding the parasites, no grants, no subsidies," is governerially analogous to the situation where on a sailing ship, you have to fix all the ropes the way they have to be, and you are not governing the ship while the ship is moving. How will this end up? This will end up with the fact that you will either crash into the rocks, or break the masts under the pressure of the wind, or capsize. In fact, the prohibition bias in relation to grants and subsidies is a request to prohibit governance towards the economy in the social interest. If you want to live in such a society and be a country of fools, that is your right. But after this, do not ask why you live so badly. Therefore, the plan should ensure a certain baseline plan profitability. But the correcting by the government of tax grant policy and subsidy allocation policy in the presentation of the plan should also be the norm. And without solving this cyclics of tasks, without support of it by the state, civilization is doomed. And further, how does the situation stand with globalization? Basically, all societies are faced with the same problems. If we talk about the encompassing problems, this is the impact of the biospheric social and ecological crisis on society. It is everywhere. The mechanism of generation of this crisis is the same everywhere. If we talk about intrasocial problems of any society, then, both in the rich countries and in poor countries, these problems are the same. This is a culture that does not allow every newborn to take place in the quality of human. Therefore, it turns out that all peoples have the same problems, the same mechanism of their generation, and the same recipes of suppressing the mechanism of generation of the problems and building a different way of life, where these problems will not exist. Therefore, the national specifics include language, clothing adapted to natural geographical conditions and regions, dwellings also adapted to natural geographical conditions of the region, national cuisine, and then what? And then all humanness. This is one for all.